Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
What's really going on, when you sense presences or hear things when you're at the edges of sleep? When you're in altered states of consciousness, are you imagining things or could you actually be somewhere or someone else? What are egregores? Well, welcome to the 872nd broadcast of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. Coming to you live from WOON AM and FM radio in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, on the Paranormal Radio app from TalkStream Live and on TuneIn.com. I am not Ben, as you know. This is our usual routine. Ben is not able to be with us today, kind of a last-minute thing, so we're kind of seat of the pants here, so please bear with us. Anyway, today we bring you an old friend on a jarring subject. If you'd like to join us on the show, call us at... Oh, I don't think we are taking calls today because of the circumstances, so no calls today, but you can send an email to paul@behindtheparanormal.com. Anthony Peake is a British author and researcher who deals with borderline areas of human consciousness. One of the world's most original thinkers, he is a graduate of the University of Warwick, England, and did postgraduate work at the London School of Economics and the University of Westminster. Since his first book, Is There Life After Death, was published in 2006, Anthony has gone on to develop his own ideas together with exploring the latest areas of research in his field. His eighth book, published in 2014, is The Immortal Mind, Science and the Continuity of Consciousness Beyond the Brain. A joint project with Professor Ervin Laszlo, the great Hungarian researcher of quantum consciousness. Anthony's 10th book, the center of our discussion today, is The Hidden Universe, an investigation into non-human intelligences. His website, Anthony Peake, that's Peake with an E, anthonypeake.com. Anthony, welcome back to Behind the Paranormal.
Always wonderful to talk to you, Paul. Always.
All right, and I feel exactly the same way as you, my friend. Anthony, knowing you and your brilliant insights, we're just going to throw this wide open at the start and see where the discussion takes us. So tell us where your research on non-human intelligence has led and what are egregores. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
You are, egregores and egregorial. Yeah, very much. It's very similar to a lot of the areas you touch upon in your book, Turning Home. And indeed, I reference you in the new book because I have to thank you for tuning my mind to think, there's something here to do with plasma. But I'll go back a little bit in terms of what we mean when we use the term egregores. The term egregore or egregorial, as you will know, is Greek, and it means watcher. And I was quite fascinated when doing my initial research into the book, and indeed research in a previous book I did called Opening the Doors of Perception, that I was particularly intrigued by the idea of the Book of Enoch and the descriptions in the Book of Enoch in the Apocryphal Bible, whereby people had encounters with these beings that were known as the Watchers. And, of course, as I said, Watcher in Greek is egregore. And it seems that these Watchers were really quite interesting characters, and they also feature, we will know as well as in the Bible, they also feature in a different guise within the role of the Anunnaki, within Sumerian legends as well. But these entities appeared on Mount Hermon in the Lebanon, or the modern-day Lebanon, and they mixed with human women and everything else as well. But it seems I thought this is an interesting trope, and I decided that this is what I would call my own model of entities that are non-human, that seem to manifest in human societies and have manifested in human societies since the beginning of time and have been recorded since the beginning of time. And I'll give an example of just how extraordinary this is, because in the opening chapter of the book, I describe an extraordinary incident that took place with my own mother, whereby she woke up in the middle of the night in a state of sleep paralysis, and while she was in sleep paralysis, she noticed that the bedroom door was open. She then noticed 3 spindly fingers come round the bedroom door, and this little entity with large black eyes looked at her, blinked, and dodged back. Now, my mother subsequently developed Alzheimer's. So this is something intriguing. It intrigued me here. Was it something about her doors of perception being open by the destruction of the amyloid plaques in her brain, by the destruction of her microtubules, by the amyloid plaques within her brain. And it was opening up the doors of perception. It was stopping the brain acting as what Henri Bergson would call an attenuator, that the brain takes out information. So under these states, people's minds get broader and they perceive a broader-based reality. But what intrigued me was that soon afterwards I discovered that there'd been a series of caves that had been discovered in northern India. And these caves had not been inhabited or even opened for 10,000 years. And inside the caves were cave drawings. And these cave drawings were identical to the being that my mother described. On top of that, you then had the strange scenario that there is a series of cave paintings in South Africa in the Drakensberg Mountains called the Junction Shelter. And these cave paintings show beings with large heads, large eyes, and exactly the same physical shape that my mother described. So we have people in India 10,000 years ago. We have a little old lady in the Wirral in UK. And we have people in a cave shelter down in South Africa showing the same entities. And they seem to be consistent, these entities. And then, of course, we then extrapolate from that, from the person who wrote the foreword to one of my previous books, Whitley Strieber, and his experiences with greys. And then we have also the similarities between these entities and people such as Aleister Crowley, with his being lamb, which if anybody's ever seen the drawings of lamb, effectively it's a grey, but it's got smaller eyes. So clearly there is some kind of trope here. Is it something that's part of us? Are these beings something that are part of our psychology? Or are they something greater? Are they something that we create with our collective minds? Is it something that is both created by us, but also uses our brain energy to come through from somewhere else? What I call the egregorial, or what I call the kenoma. The pleroma, which is from Gnosticism, and the idea that there is a universe behind this universe. And as you say in your book, there are then liminal areas whereby these areas overlap, and under certain brain states, be it people taking dimethyltryptamine, other entheogen substances, these doors of perception open and these beings are perceived. And I thought we needed a collective term for them, everything from fairies to poltergeists to everything else, and that's why I call them egregorials.
Oh, very good. May I deepen the examples that you gave, in a sense, by providing one of my own? We, Ben and myself, have been working, matter of fact, he was 13 when we started this case, and he had only just started to join me, and his mom and I had a long talk about whether he should. And one of the first cases, along with the haunted policeman of Vermont, as we called it, was the flap area, a term we had to coin, in Connecticut. And there was a little boy who was 4 years old, and one of the many aspects of this case was that this little boy had an invisible friend. And the name was Ashwar, A-S-H-W-A-R, we assumed. And he said, Ashwarner people live in trees. So there would be all sorts of minor poltergeist phenomena going on. That people would walk into this room, toys would be floating in the air, and he was playing with Ashwar. Well, one day in 2010, Ben and I were there. We'd been filming with a crew from New York for one of the abortive series that we've been talking about, because something always would come in from somewhere and stomp on it. And he had said, oh, my friend Ashwar is out in the tree in front. And we went out and we simply pointed the infrared camera up into the tree. And we got this thing coming down out of the tree, and people can see this on the Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Benino Facebook page. It's, I believe, the second video in, and it's almost like a whitish tadpole thing coming down out of the tree, and then there's a flash and it disappears. I mean, was this Ashwar? Well, some years later, our rather amazing colleague, Shane Searway, who is a co-host of the show from time to time here, he happened to be doing some research on something else, and he ran across the name Ashwar, A-C-H-U-A-R, which was a Central American and South American tribal group who were very involved with trees. They worshiped tree spirits, and sometimes they lived in trees and this sort of thing. And, I mean, we drew the lines between the dots here, and how could this 4-year-old child in Connecticut know about this tribe or this Ashwar? And this being, in ensuing years, we watched it very carefully, It turned out, in our opinion, to be a parasite. Because when the boy passed 10 years old and got to be 12 and 13, it started to tell him to hurt his mother. And this is sort of a textbook giveaway that this is something negative. And whether it was the same being, I don't know. But I mean, it's an example of what you've been saying. And we're still looking for illustrations, whether it be cave paintings or anything else, of these Ashwar people or the spirits involved. But there you go, Anthony. Perhaps another arrow in the quiver.
Oh, no, absolutely, because this is intriguing, because as you know, in the book, I have a section on what's called quasi-corporal companions.
Yes.
And quasi-corporal companions is something that was coined by a guy called Halliwell in a book that was written around about 7 or 8 years ago. And Halliwell argues that whatever these entities are, children perceive them. Now, I'd argue, and as you know, I'm very keen to do the science of these things. I'm not somebody that just makes these glib statements and says you have to believe me because I'm channeling it from the planet Tharg. I'm somebody that actually does the science. And it is intriguing that it could be something to do with myelination of the neurons of the brain, because the neurons are isolated by myelination, which is the kind of the covering, as it were, like you have an electrical cable and you'll have the plastic covering. Myelination is like that. But myelination doesn't actually take place until a child is 6 or 7 years of age. So could it be that their perception field within the neurons is broader, so therefore they can perceive broader areas of reality? But on top of this, there's even something more intriguing, is the linkages of the corpus callosum, which is the body of nerves that holds together the two sides of the brain. Now, if this is the case, it means effectively that children are almost bicameral, as Julian James would argue. So children can open up their brains are more attuned to opening up these things. Now, if this is the case, I would argue that children have this effect, and then it starts again when people develop Alzheimer's, because I'd argue that the disease of Alzheimer's, when it destroys the microtubules within the neurons, does exactly the same thing. And this is why elderly people start developing something called Charles Bonnet syndrome. And of course, Charles Bonnet syndrome is exactly the same thing. People see things like my mother did. Now, these entities, I believe, are always there. And I believe that, and we need to do the science of this, and I think your argument that they're a form of plasma and the way they're always linked with electromagnetic energy of some description or another is powerful evidence that they're manipulating this reality in some way to come through. Now, there have been papers written on the creation of tulpas.
I was just going to mention tulpas, yeah.
And Alexander Neal and the work that this wonderful Belgian lady did in the 1920s when she was traveling in Tibet, where they created a thought form. And the thought form came through and then started to become independent. Now, if you start looking at the history of mediumship, and you start looking at how mediums manifest the spirits, you suddenly find that there's a linkage made here. I mean, I'm reminded here of the Joe Fisher case. And Joe Fisher, an English guy that was actually living in the States, living in Canada, was interested in manifesting spirits. And there were spirits that attached themselves to him through a medium. And it was called the Hungry Ghosts. And this being was talking to him through a spirit medium, but the being was lying to him. The being was pretending to be something that it wasn't. And in your book, you make the very powerful statement where you say, don't believe that the entities you're talking to as a medium is Great Aunt Doris or your grandmother. It's a far more complex phenomenon than that. These are beings that are manipulating your world for their own nefarious purposes and have been doing for centuries. The question is, what are their motivations? Why do they do it? And I think your point on parasites, I think, is excellent. They feed upon our fear. They feed upon our orgone energy, to actually use a term that is much discredited, but Wilhelm Reich and his concept of orgone energy. Could orgone energy be a nutritional thing for these entities that come through to us? Are we, as you say, being farmed?
Yes, exactly. One of the issues, as you bring it up, is that of tulpas, and one does wonder, in the case of Ashwar, whether the boy, despite his youth, was able to produce a thought form that literally took form and became independent. my personal opinion, just from my experience, and that's really all that I have is the experience with things like this, is that they are, in most cases, independent entities already, for whom the dinner bell is rung, as it were, by people who are negative. And I wish I could put, I always say, today's paranormal is tomorrow's science. And one often wonders, how can one put a finger on the science of the feeding of parasites, if that's indeed what it is? And the best way one can describe it, in my experience, is simply to say that whatever divides, whatever pulls us apart, is negative, and that is what they seem to feed upon. Our best remedy for parasitical entities that are farming, as we say, a home or even something more aggressive, whether it be poltergeist or even the possession phenomenon, is simply to bring in what Ben and I jocularly call the Peter Pan theory, which is think happy thoughts, come together, laugh. And I specify in one of my books that in I got rid of the worst poltergeist I ever dealt with by using a joke book. Not the normal remedy I would suggest in normal circumstances, but under the unique circumstances of this case, it did work, and the things were never seen again. So again, and I always tell my boys, don't laugh, but not at each other, because you keep it positive.
Well, this is reminiscent, isn't it? Sorry for jumping in there, but
no.
It's reminiscent, isn't it, of the Philip case, 1971 in Toronto, whereby a group of people got together and collectively created a thought form. And they created thought form. And the technique they used, as you probably know from the book, which was terribly difficult to get hold of, myself and a couple of associates managed to source a book, the original Philip book. And what the group did, Mrs. Owen and her husband and the little group they worked together in, they managed to create it by actually becoming like children. And this is of significance, that initially they kept failing in creating something. But what they did was they literally created a mythical character, and they gave him a story and a backstory. He was called Philip Aylesford. He lived in Warwickshire in the English Midlands. He was a Catholic nobleman during the English Civil War. He was an outsider because of that. He then falls in love with a gypsy girl, which then alienates him from his wife, and then he commits suicide from the battlements of his castle. Now, what was intriguing here was that initially they had the backstory, but they couldn't get the entity to manifest, because they came to the conclusion that this is what is taking place, that it's a collective thought form that people create. But when they discovered that as they got more friendly with each other, they started to act like children. They started to say silly jokes. They started to sing with each other, childhood rhymes and things. And when that happened, Philip started to manifest. And not only about that but there was actually, they had telekinetic powers, and they actually managed to make one of the table they were working on rise up in the air. And this has been filmed. It was in the TV studio in Toronto, where the table, you could see the table rising. Now, these were not believers in the phenomenon. They were people wanting to understand the power of the human mind. Now, again, there's the idea, to be as a child just lightens it up. And in which case, because Philip was, whatever it was, there was poltergeist activity, and was a benevolent entity. And again, I'm reminded here of how similar it was to Imperator and Rector, which was work that was done by the Society for Psychical Research, Stainton Moses, way back in the 1880s and 1890s in London. Then you have, in the 1980s, you had the Skull experiment in Norfolk in England, where they, again, seem to collectively create communicants. Now, but the interesting thing is these communicants identified themselves as being a research group somewhere else trying to communicate with us, as was similar in the Imperator and Rector case. But again, you and I would argue, but if these entities can't necessarily be trusted, they will manifest themselves in whatever way they can to gain the security of the people that they're working with. And again, if anybody takes the opportunity to read the Joe Fisher book, it's intriguing, because towards the end, Fisher becomes convinced that whatever the entities are that are playing with him, and he killed himself in the end, he committed suicide, which is fascinating.
It is. One of the, let's take this a little bit deeper, if that's even possible. one of the issues that's come up in a new organization called the CCRI, the Consciousness and Contact Research Institute, organized by the great Ray Hernandez.
I know Ray. Yeah. I know
okay,
Ray.
Good. Actually, I'm going to stick my neck out here that you should be involved.
They have. They invited me. I was right at the very start. Ray contacted me, a lovely guy, and I had a series of Skype chats with a lot of them. And there's a friend of mine, Mariam Ibadi, who knows them all as well. And the work they're doing is extraordinary. We're taking a very slightly different angle to them. They're tending to take the idea that the entities are actually alien entities, whereas we're taking a far more psychological and a far more careful approach, my little research group. But there's overlap between the two groups.
Well, that's it. Well, Ben is on the advisory board, and I'm on the research committee with many of the people you spoke with. They seem to be willing to be guided more toward our point of view. One of the issues is that of non-human intelligences. Okay, that's all fine, but there may be other interactions that are with perfectly human intelligences of different forms. If this multiverse approach is correct, and we're dealing with whether other facets of ourselves, as we call it, or some of the people I dealt with, the neighbors, as I call them in Dancing Past the Graveyard, who seem to be perfectly human, but living in parallel realities, who don't speak English the same way we do, who don't speak English at all, some of whom are entirely nonverbal. I mean, you name it, and the variations seem to be there.
Well, your children experiment, in Ottawa, with the children that you saw, or your case study saw, clearly to me, we are dealing here with probably two different things, and you and I are both on the same page in terms of the idea of if its multiverse theory is correct, and there's more and more evidence to suggest it may be, and if this is the case, then there are multiverses, and there's billions of versions of you and I having this conversation. There are subtly different universes that overlap on each other, and in which case, when we pick up, as you again say, and again I've said this in my books, that when people claim they're reincarnated and they are sensing a previous life in India or wherever, what they're actually doing is tuning into a singular consciousness that it's experiencing itself subjectively, which is all of us. And in your book you make, and it was wonderful, I'd never realized, in your book you make this wonderful phrase about, in the biblical phrase, as, to love your neighbor as yourself. But the thing is, it is yourself. We are a single consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. Then if you plan that through the multiverses, then you have something to do with quantum physics. You have the idea of entanglement. You have the idea, for example, and I use the science of this in my next book, which I'm working on at the moment. I'm going to be bringing up on this. But the idea is entanglement, which we can't go into detail now, but it's a known quantum physics effect. And again, I seriously do the science on this. I don't just use the terms. I do understand as best as anybody possibly can what quantum physics means. But in terms of entanglement, if you take two subatomic particles and you put them in the same state for a period of time, they can communicate instantaneously across vast distances. Now, Professor David Bohm, the Anglo-American physicist in the 1980s, David Bohm argued, at Birkbeck College, he argued that all particles are actually one particle, and we're just seeing it in different ways. As Richard Feynman once jokingly said, why do electrons all look the same? They all look the same because from our point of view, there's countless numbers of them. From their point of view, it's just one moving at infinite speed. So the first billionth of a second, trillionth of a second of the Big Bang, every piece of matter that exists now was entangled with every other piece of matter. So when the Big Bang takes place, we're in this scenario whereby everything was entangled, and that entanglement continues. And of course, we then have the illusion of what we believe is space. But what is space if there's no objects in space? Does space disappear, as Ernest Mach argued? That if there's only two objects in space, and they're near each other, and then one disappears, where does the space around go? These are deep philosophical questions, and questions that suggest the unitariness. Now, there is growing belief now again, research being done seriously, like close to you in Ontario. There's the Perimeter Institute with people like Craig Hogan. They are looking for the pixelation of space. They're arguing that space is information and that it works holographically. Now, what do we know about holograms? A holographic image, if it's smashed, each piece of the holographic image has a denuded image of the whole picture. So again, we have what David Bohm would call enfoldment. So everything is enfolded. And what we need to do is to start realizing that our science is great. Our science works incredibly well. Our understanding of quantum physics works so well. But it's not complete. It's nowhere even near complete. There is a paradox used in science, and it's the idea that every civilization believes that its science is the pinnacle of science. But of course it's not. What's the statistical chance of us existing in a world where we know 95% of what's happening, when in fact we know 94% of the universe is missing? So clearly we're suffering from a severe case here of hubris in saying that we understand. We are like medieval schoolmen with their epicycles trying to explain the retrograde motion of the outer planets. We have these mathematical structures that explains things, but they only explain partially. We have two complete different realities. We have quantum physics and cosmology. The maths don't even work between the two. You plug in the calculations that you use for quantum mechanics and plug them into Einstein's relativity. They don't work. They bring out infinities, which suggests that there is, as Einstein argued, there are hidden variables and at a deeper level of reality, sense comes back. And the whole quantum physics world, which seems totally crazy, is because we've gone down this path and we're too scared to move away anymore. But we know that things that we've experienced, we know things that people report to us, we know these effects are real. We know precognition patterns. So in which case, let's be real scientists, not people suffering from scientism.
Yes.
Let's start looking at the facts. Let's look at the empirical evidence from experience, empirical. Let's look at what people tell us and just follow, as scientists have done years gone by, just follow where the information tells you. And don't, for God's sake, just play this game of saying it's an hallucination. Right. You know, nobody knows what an hallucination is. Oliver Sacks's last book was about hallucinations. We don't know what hallucinations are, so to just categorize something, it's what I call the label theory of science. We've labeled it, we've given it a nice name, let's give it a nice Latin or Greek name. It'll sound even more impressive. But what it means is, it's like idiopathic in medicine. Somebody said, I've got idiopathic epilepsy. What do you mean idiopathic? Idiopathic means we haven't got the vaguest idea. We don't know what causes it. And that's what we're doing. We have idiopathic science at the moment. There's a new term. I'll probably use that one.
Oh, well done. Well, very good. Well, we're going to take our mid-show break here. It's unofficial because we're not in the studio today. However, you're listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON 1240 AM, 99.5 FM in Rhode Island's beautiful Blackstone River Valley. And we're simulcasting today on TuneIn.com and the Paranormal Radio app from TalkStream Live with our incredible guest, one of our favorite, probably our favorite, Anthony Peake. Coming to us from the UK via Skype today. So let's get back to our discussion. And why don't we start with a question from a listener, Anthony? And this is, we have a very faithful listener in Bogota, Colombia, who sends in questions that are very, very incisive. Almost every week, he's almost like an honorary guest co-host. So here's a question for Anthony. What is really happening with alien abductions? Do you think they creating hybrids, if they are creating hybrids, and if so, why? That's a bit of a shift from our discussion.
Yeah, it is. My opinion on alien abductions is they're far more complex than that. For instance, if you start to look at as a sociologist, the way I'd look at alien abductions is what are the typologies, what are the similarities? And the similarities of alien abductions, you can take them straight back to shamanic traveling. Shamanic traveling, shamans, when they go into the shamanic world, one of the things that happens to them is they get dismembered. Creatures will come and will tear into them, will operate on them. So this is something that goes back throughout the centuries. You then have the people being stolen and the children being stolen by the little people in Ireland and in Celtic Scotland. People get abducted by the fairies, by the fairy folk, by the gentry. So it then continues, and you carry this forward, and then you'll get the same tropes occurring within people who have encounters when they take dimethyltryptamine. They take DMT, a mind-altering substance known as an entheogen, which is to find the God within, which is an interesting aside point. But effectively, when people do this, they again have the dismemberment idea, where they get tortured, they get picked upon, they get watched. Now, the question I have to ask is this, and it's a billion-dollar question in terms of these experiments that supposedly they're doing. Supposedly, the grey aliens, or the aliens, or whatever we want to call them, since the 1950s have been abducting farmers from Midwest, taking them into the machine and cutting them open in order to find out what's going on inside. Now, either these guys are incredibly thick, because they seem to be cutting people open all the time and still don't seem to discover anything. They don't have fMRI scanners. They don't have ways of scanning a body, yet supposedly they can travel across the vast distances of interstellar space to hassle a farmer in Idaho. You know, it makes no sense. So then we're saying, is there some kind of hybridization taking place? Well, there could be. There could be that for some reason genetically they've gone down a different path. But I think they're far closer to us than this. I recall, you know, in Sufi Islamic teaching about the idea of the djinn. Mm-hmm. And the djinn abduct people. And what are the djinn made of? If you read in the Quran and you read in the commentaries and everything else, they're made of smokeless fire. What's smokeless fire? Plasma.
Exactly.
Okay. Now again, we know that the jinn will steal you and will take you to somewhere else. So again, to me, this is. And as they say, you know, these in the Quran, I think they say, you know, these things are as close as your jugular vein. They're part of us. We are a greater consciousness, and they are part of us. So to just simplify it again and again, I'm always fascinated as a ufologist, and I've been a ufologist in my, you know, following ufology since the mid-1960s. So I do know my UFO lore. It seems to be that the UFOs cleverly, culturally follow. Whatever our culture is about to develop, they seem to do it. Like, you know, we had in the late 1890s, we had the airship flaps in the United States.
We just did a show on that.
Okay, because it's interesting, isn't it? They were supposedly Germans, and when they were asked where they came from, they'd say they were German. In medieval times, they said they came from Magonia, the concept of Jacques Vallée. Then you take it forward, and as they take it forward, they seem to change from airships to, you know, we have the trauma of the Second World War and the burgeoning scientific age and the burgeoning space age, and suddenly they're spaceships. They seem to morph into things. In medieval times, they were people from, you know, sort of the fairy folk again. So it seems that they know us very well. And if they're from a timeless place that is part of this greater universe, they can switch where they want to be, what they want to look like, and they're playing games with us. It's a game. You know, the machine elves of Terence McKenna, what do? They mock people. They're having fun with people. So we expect to be abducted, and because of our traditions of shamanism and everything else, we expect them to cut us open. So that's what they do. It's my idea, anyway. That's my thought.
Well, it makes perfect sense, all the way down to the car key gnomes that people often, you know, will say, well, can't find their keys. But we often run into that, little glitches in the flow of the multiverse, in a sense, or the world families. You put your car keys down on the kitchen table, and then you turn around, and they're at the other end of the table or gone completely. I mean, these little things that we will shortly forget about, or, you know, one of those things and all this business. So all the way to what you've been describing, Anthony.
Well, it could be, couldn't it? Just very quickly coming in
Sure.
here, just very quickly. You know, if you look into quantum physics, there's a concept called the collapse of the wave function.
Absolutely.
And effectively, the act of observation collapses a wave, a probability wave, not even a real wave, but a mathematical probability wave, into a point particle, which effectively means your act of observation is creating your visual world and your physical world around you by collapsing the wave function from a myriad of outcomes your observation reduces it down to one reality. But all the other realities are still there. So your keys could be there 1 minute and not there the next because you're just flipping inside realities.
Yes. One of the many wonderful aspects of your book, which I have right here, Hidden Universe. Okay, there we are. It has an excellent section in the beginning on, I would call it sort of comparative theologies and the philosophy of mind. And one of our principles that we always talk about in Turning Home is that at some point our remote ancestors thought they were talking to supernatural beings, and certainly fills right in many of the gaps of our historical experience, and certainly is consistent with what we're talking about today. And when we have supernatural beings, one can argue that this experience, whatever it was the origin of both the paranormal and religion, which are supposed to be at such odds, or really science and religion, because had there been no questions to be asked, would there have been a science? And certainly would there have been religion? So perhaps the paranormal, or the unexplained at least, is the mother of both science and religion. So,
well, this would be, wouldn't it, Julian James? Julian James,
yes.
And the bicameral mind, 1969, 1970, and he argued that if you look at ancient Greek writings, specifically things like Homer's The Iliad, you will find that there's no internal narrative taking place in the characters. The characters, all their actions are the actions of gods. The gods tell them what to do, and they do it. And this is again to do with the idea that the brain was unicameral at the time. So effectively, our inner voice was interpreted. We all have this inner voice, the narrative of our lives. But because of the way the brain was structured at that time, we heard that inner voice as an alien voice that was talking to us and guiding us. Mm-hmm. And in which case, the whole idea of the supernatural, it is religion. It's all looking through the veil and trying to understand what seems to be a completely confusing universe,
One of the interesting facets of this when it comes to religion is the religious groups that can accept the idea of alien life forms and things of this kind. And we presented a program. We've only presented it twice, but it's had a tremendous reception. And it's called God, Religion, and the Aliens or the Paranormal. And looking at the different groups, and I've looked at, I have a seminary background. For 100 years I was, studying theology. And if you look at the groups that are more open-minded about this, it's the Muslims and the Eastern Orthodox Christians, which is kind of ironic because they're not always the best of friends throughout history. So you have groups that would be able to welcome alien life forms. If you're from another planet and you don't have the black spot theory of original sin, where you had to be child of Adam in order to need to be saved and baptized and all, the theology would be very acceptable to the Orthodox and the Muslims. You could bring them into your faith without having to worry about any of that. So, but they all have ancient traditions, as you know, Tony, of these contacts with flying things. I've counted over 300 examples in the Bible alone of objects that are flying, hovering, landing, or otherwise being active, and not according to the technology of the time necessarily. So I'm wondering too. You mentioned DMT. Now, to bring in another wrinkle to this narrative, how much do you think of the remote ancestors' experiences were on account of hallucinogens? Now, I've had shamans tell me that, particularly from South America, they use DMT and things of this kind, and that it's perfectly legitimate. It doesn't mean they were imagining things. It's just that it deepened their experience. What are your thoughts on that? Would the use of drugs delegitimize any sort of experience of this kind, in your opinion?
Yeah, I wrote a whole book on this subject.
I know, that's why I asked the question.
And I am particularly intrigued by this and the role of entheogens in terms of contact with entities and also within religious beliefs. Because we know many, many years ago, John Allegro wrote a very, very famous book in the late 1960s, I think it was, where he claimed that, was it mascara? It was one of the hallucinogenic substances, was the prime mover of even Christianity, even the start of Christianity. Now, if you start looking back into a lot of the traditions of even the Abrahamic religions, you see evidence that there could be hallucinogenic substances going on. For instance, one of the things I found quite extraordinary is the symbolism of things like the burning bush and the idea about the burning bush. Now, was that Syrian rue? And if it was Syrian rue, it would have been hallucinogenic. The symbolism of the ladder and everything else as well. So that's within Judaism. You then start moving into the use of substances in order to get into altered states of consciousness. Myself and a group of friends, we are planning, or a group of associates and academics, we're planning to reproduce. We did an event called Plato's Cave, Escaping Plato's Cave, which we did in the UK last April. Now, one of my books has just come out in Greek, in the Greek language. This book that you're showing now has just come out in Greek. And my first book will be coming out in Greek in the spring. And my Greek publisher is very keen for us to continue with some of the implications of the hidden universe. And what we're going to do is we're going to be recreating the myth of Plato's cave in what I believe from my research, it was the cave that Plato actually placed Plato's cave. Now, Plato himself was probably a member of the Eleusinian mysteries. So therefore, his belief systems were based upon these mystery cults of the ancient Greeks. You look at the mystery cults of the ancient Greeks, you find that it's hallucinogenic substances. They're talking about a substance called kykeon. They're also talking about a substance called ambrosia, the food of the gods. Now, there is a clear argument to say that these substances were hallucinogenic, in which case when people go into altered states of consciousness, they find the god within, the entheogen, and that allows them to appreciate and apprehend the noetic within the world, and they move into an altered state of mental consciousness whereby they can attune with gods. Now, we know from ancient traditions, like in North America, there were the Native Americans traditions, like the Sioux, where they had the sun ceremony, which was in that movie A Man Called Horse many years ago, where they would pull people up by pins, and they do that because the pain would be so great, somebody would be in an altered state of consciousness. We know with flagellation and flagellants in the Middle Ages would do this to get into altered states of consciousness. But a lot of the Native American peoples also had things like peyote. They could take peyote and go at altered states of consciousness. We also know about the Cenarian toad, which is a toad that when it's distressed, it excretes something called 5-MeO-DMT, which can bring about profound godlike sensations, where literally friends of mine who've taken 5-MeO-DMT say that when you take it, you're at one with the universe. You really realize that the universe is a singularity and you are part of it. So that they're profound religious experiences. You then get down to Latin America, and you get down to the indigenous cultures of the Amazonian river areas, and suddenly you find extraordinary things taking place there. I'll give one example of this. I think it was a guy called Michael Hartman. Was it Michael Hartman? I can't remember now. But it was one of the researchers, and he was down there, and he asked. They were really confused because I don't know if you know that they have a substance down there called ayahuasca.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay, so ayahuasca is a mixture of two plants. Banisteriapsis capi and Psychiatra viridas. Okay, they're two plants. The Banisterius is a vine. Okay, and the Psychiatra viridas is a plant. Now, there are 50,000, I've heard, different varieties of plants in the Amazonian forests. These two substances together, when they're put together, they mix them together in a particular way, and they brew this thing called ayahuasca. Okay. Now, the Psychiatra viridas contains DMT. It contains dimethyltryptamine. The Banisteriapsis capi contains a substance called harmaline. Okay. So what is really taking place here? Well, apparently, if you took the leaves of the DMT plant, the Psychiatra viridas, and ate them, however many you ate and however much you took into your body DMT, you'd never have an hallucination. The reason being that the stomach immediately lines itself with called monoamine oxidase. Monoamine oxidase, MAO, is the substance that lines the stomach and stops the psychometric substance traveling into the blood. Okay? However, Banisteriopsis caapi contains this harmaline stuff, which is an MAO inhibitor, which means that when it goes in together, one of the substances in the mixture stops the body from its ability to stop the hallucinogenic substance. Now, when the scientists looked at this, they said, how do these guys know this? How could they possibly know? And they asked the shamans. And the shamans said that when originally we used to go shamanic traveling, because of course shamans can get into these altered states of consciousness by rhythmic dancing and everything else, or they experience temporal lobe epilepsy, or whatever we want to understand how people get into altered states of consciousness. When they went into those, they met the spirits of the plants. And the spirits of the plants literally took the shamans into the jungle and said, you pick this plant, and you put them together, and you can allow normal people to experience what you experience. So what is the spirit of the plants here? What is the entities that are communicating here? I'd argue it's exactly the same. It's, because we know there's the Santa Deum church down in Brazil where their sacrament is DMT. So clearly there is something far more going on, and it goes right through history, this interface. And an excellent book on this, Paul Devereaux wrote an amazing book on this. You know Paul, he's a great guy, isn't he?
Absolutely.
And Paul Devereaux wrote a book on it, I think it's called The Long Journey. And in it he describes such things as I've just mentioned now about the links to Kaikion, in terms of the ancient Greek mystery cults, and in terms of that, the Syrian Ru, and you carry it right forward, right across. And I think the main item here is the pineal gland. And I think, and again, just to come back to my first point, did you know that the ancient Hebrew name of the place where they had the vision of the ladder, where Jacob had the vision of the ladder, was called Pineal?
I did not know that.
Yeah.
All the years in the seminary, they never told me.
You look it up. The work. There's a guy that you must get on the show called Rabbi Joel Baxt. He lives in near somewhere in Colorado, near Colorado Springs. I could probably remember the town if I thought about it. Something near Colorado Springs, anyway. And he's written an amazing book called the Dragon in the Torah. And in this, he describes, by going into the Torah and going deeply into the descriptions of the Torah, you can actually discover they're talking about DMT.
Wow.
And they're talking about DMT and the spirit of DMT, the dragon spirit. Because if you've read the books of various people, they seem to manifest as snakes. People have snake experiences. And the snakes are symbolic of DMT. And they're also symbolic of the caduceus. They're symbolic of the twin snakes going up. And if you look at the caduceus, what do you see? You see twin snakes going up, and up the top you have two wings, and in between the two wings is a circle. That's the pineal gland. The two wings are the sides of the brain, and the two snakes going up are the Ida and Pingala of Kundalini experiences. Okay?
Symbol of the medical profession.
Pardon?
The symbol of the medical profession.
It's the symbol of the medical profession because, of course, it's Hermes, isn't it? It's Hermes' stick. Yes. But clearly there's also symbolism within, if you start looking into the symbolism you find within the Masons, Masonic symbolism and everything else as well, you read the writings of people like Manly Hall, you'll discover that this is a secret that's been known. The role of the pineal gland, the role of entheogens, the role of endogenously generated dimethyltryptamine. And I believe it's stimulated and it's simulated and it's created from melatonin within the pineal gland. And it creates an internal substance which we call metatonin, which is endogenous DMT.
And this even comes down to what's in our folklore, which we characterize as the vessel of the memory of the human race. When you mentioned the toad, all I could think of is, kiss the toad or the frog, and it turns into a prince. It's very well based in something that occurred in the human experience. So, Anthony, we're almost out of time. Tell us again about, we're going to do a bunch of shows here because we can't stop. We have to keep going. About your books, your website, where people can find out more.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. My website is anthonypeake.com. I'm not as active on there as I should be, but you can, if you want autographed books, you can get them on there. But if you want my books, just you can order from bookshops. You can order them on Amazon. They're everywhere. Yeah. Also, 3 of my books are now, with me reading them, are in Audible. Unfortunately, this book will be coming out on Audible. The Hidden Universe will be coming out on Audible in about 2 or 3 months' time. But for some reason, that publisher didn't want me to read the book. They wanted somebody else to read it, which is a slight cause of contention with me, but it's one of those things. Because I know my readers prefer to have me reading my books, but it's one of their things. So you can get in Audible, you can get them on Kindle, they're in ebook, they're every variety you can find them. I'm also very, very active on Facebook. You'll find me on Facebook. I do my own interviews on Facebook as well with guests, and I must get you, Paul, as a future guest on here. By the way, I must be talking to you. I'll talk to you privately about this. Yes. I do live interviews on Facebook every Monday. I also do every month, which you've been on, and also an interview you and Paul were on a few years ago, which it's called Consciousness Hour. Also now I'm much more active on YouTube. I have my own YouTube channel. And I'm uploading all my previous interviews on there, so you've got a documentation of all the people that have been involved in my work over the years as well. Because the most important thing for me is I believe in the diktat of Marcello Trui, the skeptic. Extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. Okay, it wasn't Carl Sagan, by the way. It's called the Sagan Statement, but it wasn't Carl Sagan. It was Marcello Trui. He nicked it. Okay.
There we are.
And to me, that's the most important thing. I will always do the science. I start with the science and then make conclusions or at least suggestions from the science, because that's where it has to start. Because it is only by using the science that we're going to change this paradigm and have science start looking at phenomena like we've been discussing now. And there are more and more scientists and more researchers coming to me now. And they are coming to me, really serious researchers, postdoctoral researchers in subjects, because they're starting to pick up my books and going, why the hell is this guy's books in the New Age range? He's writing stuff that is absolutely mind-blowing and factually correct. And I always say to people, if you have problems with my science, great, just let me know. If you think I've misinterpreted the twin slit experiment, if you think I don't understand Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, if you think I don't understand Pauli's exclusion principle, tell me, and we can debate it. But don't just criticize me without approaching me and discussing it. If I've got something wrong, I'm a big boy. I'm not a believer in anything. So if I've got something wrong, just tell me, and I'll amend my ideas.
Precisely. Well said. I couldn't add anything better to that than what you said, Anthony. Anthony, we're going to move on to our announcements. You can stick with us, but thank you for an incredible show. You're not only amazing, you're inspiring. So I think that's a promise of many more frequent shows to come. All right, so let's begin our announcements. With any luck, COVID-wise, we plan to speak at the New England Parafest on April 10th and 11th, 2021 in Kittery, Maine, and we will do a live broadcast of this show with a panel of the speakers on Sunday the 11th. More information will be forthcoming. We are working on a new book, Bev and myself. In addition, additional authors, co-authors, Shane Serway and Alexander Petikoff. That'll be out later next year. Behind the Paranormal 3, Uneasy Skies. I belong to MUFON, it's the only thing I belong to, and we speak at UFO conferences, so we thought we ought to at least do the courtesy of writing a book on the subject. That's based on our own UFO experiences and those of our show guests over the years. Check out our current books, along with those of our other co-hosts at the show website, behindtheparanormal.com, where you can also find more about the show, our many cases over the years, our public appearances, and how to book us, along with some of our 900-plus free recorded shows from our 12-plus years on the air, including our 4.5-year run on CBS Radio, along with special shows and podcasts. Past shows, again, back to late 2009, are also available on the major podcast platforms and apps, including YouTube, iTunes, Apple Podcasts. And we are still migrating our site over to a new host, and we plan to have all 900-plus shows uploaded there eventually. Just sort of stay tuned. There are links also to several charities we have adopted on the show, including USA Cares, Canadian Veterans Advocacy, Helping Haiti's Orphans, Youth Mentoring Connection in Los Angeles, and Crohn's and Colitis Foundation of America, and the Sisterhood of Ground Zero, along with special shows and podcasts. So next week, Ben will be back, I hope, December 6th, we'll welcome back the Hudson Valley-based paranormal researcher and author Linda Zimmerman for a look at animal reactions to UFOs, something that has not been well studied. We leave you today with a quote from someone who came up in the show today. I was going to bring him up. The 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. We are not rich by what we possess, but by what we can do without. I'm Paul Eno. Please, I'll give you best to Ben. He'll be back next week, and thank you for joining us.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.